Chapter 23. Circles of Protection. The Brotherhood of GIX summoned their master to Mishra's workshop. The priests did so only because Mishra, the artifice Kadir of the falange, was going to decamp soon, moving westward to the caravan city of Tomikul. The Scythian front had expanded into a full-fledged war, and Mishra needed to be closer to action. Already manpower had been stripped from occupied Yosha, and troops were making the long trek north and west to the wooded shores of Ronham Lake. The Gixians knew of these decisions, for they had infiltrated most of the daily workings of the workshop and the surrounding factories. Over the past few years they had become a regular part of Mishra's court and were for the most part tolerated. They had spun that tolerance into a web of information. Little came to Mishra's factory that did not reach the Gixians' ears, and through them, their master. The mines were mostly tapped out now, said the reports from Yosha, and entire mountains were being stripped away for any resources they could provide. Similarly, the tribute of men and supplies from Zegon was drying up. Far-off Almaz had bought its own protection by sharing its mystic song mages, but Mishra was now depending on that nation for iron and lumber as well. Then there was Saranth. There were the official commanders. Reports of great dragon-like worms that haunted the forests, and light troops who struck from ambush. The city of Saranth itself, immured to years of assaults from the Umok nation to the north, was as hard to crack as an iron-shod chestnut. There were other Scythian reports, these from Ashnod, and harder for the Gixians to get their hands on. They're not impossible. These reports were friendly and conversational, but they never failed to mention the problems of the current falange commander and the inevitable tragedy that would ensue if the red-haired woman were not immediately given free rein in military matters. Mishra held firm to his decision. He did not give her a command, nor did he call her back to his side, and the Gixians approved of both decisions. And last there were the reports from the east, from the passes through the KH ridges to Argive and Corlus. The war. There was a slow grinding process, as two titans hurled themselves against each other. Urza was busy at that, there was no doubt, ripping huge chunks from the Argivian landscape to feed his own war machines. The land was ringed with towers that appeared almost overnight, each tower containing mechanical protections. The camp was awash in rumors that the Argivians were about to cross the mountains and the desert and press on into occupied Yosha. Mishra was forced to relocate his court to Tomikul, closer to the heart of his empire, closer to the siege of Saranth, and further from the thinly defended Yoshan border. This last item was a bad thing for the Brotherhood of GIX. Such a move would disrupt their organization, which they had shaped into a perfect machine. So they gathered in their quarters, situated beside the spillage from one of the great iron foundries, and called their master. The chant was logical and precise, their motions practiced and machine-like. They had been taught how to call upon GIX before. They left Koilos, and the demon had left precise instructions when to call upon him. Now, in the windowless room of the small quarters, the 24 brothers chanted the proper dirges and motioned their hands in the proper manner, carving symbols in the air. In return, the air winged it up, coalescing into a great pillar of blackish smoke, smelling of burning oil. There was the sound of crashing gears, and from the smoke stepped their master. GIX resplendent in his living armor, his snake-like tendrils flexing and coiling from the back of his head. "You have summoned me," said GIX. "I trust it is for good reason." GIX moved unseen through the darkness of the desert night landscape, hidden from the heavens by clouds of smoke and illuminated from beneath by the light of the foundries that ran around the clock. The great trees that had originally cradled the factories were dead now, their lumber sawn up and used to make catapults, rams, dragon engines, and other war machines. The surviving stumps had been hollowed out and converted to barracks and foundries and plated with sheets of thin copper. There were still humans about, both warriors and slaves, but much of the work was now done by automatons, great clanking beasts that shuffled mindlessly from one task to the next. It was no phyrexia, thought the demon, but it was a good start. His followers had been correct. Once Mishra relocated his command center, he would be tougher to strike at. Further, it might take years for the human artificer to raise Tomahawk to the same wonderful level of civilization that he had achieved in this region. Now was the time to strike, the demon thought, before the advantage was lost. GIX moved like a spirit through the empty hallways and mechanized forges. He left his children, the priests, behind, after rewarding them with a touch of the dreams of phyrexia. They lay in a stupor now, dreaming of their mechanical paradise. GIX moved best alone, where he discovered GIX knew that with but to thought he could easily return to Koilos. He had gained an affinity with the desert caverns over the years, and simply by willing it so he could travel there. He needed help from his priests to be summoned elsewhere, but he could go home at will. GIX allowed a narrow smile to cross his lipless face. He thought of Koilos as home now. Not phyrexia, to which he could not return, not at least without first punishing the interloper, not without taking from the trespasser his valued stone of power. There was only one incident en route to the workshop. An automaton from one of Mishra's factories crossed before him. Sensing something unfamiliar, it stopped in place, whirring menacingly. GIX was uncertain if the machine had the rude sentience to recognize him as a stranger, or if it was merely sounding an alarm as an automatic reaction. In the passing years he had developed an understanding of these simple machines made by clumsy mortal children. GIX reached out mentally to the artifact, caressing it with soft words as a human would comfort a wounded animal. It did not matter if the animal understood the words, only that it understood the intent behind them. The priesthood back in Koilos had been rebuilding the old Suchi automatons, and this one was little different from them. The machine shivered for a moment as Gix's mind touched the small shard of power stone that served both as its heart and brain. The demon changed only a few small matrices within the crystal itself, but those were enough to convince the lead-minded device there was nothing out of the ordinary, and no alarm need be sounded. The automaton stopped whirring and soon scooted out of sight. GIX entered the workshop, gliding past bleary-eyed guards who no more noticed his passing than they did the smokes that now rose from the surrounding landscape. The demon's feet did not touch the ground as he floated effortlessly to the thief's chambers, where his minions had assured him his prey awaited. Indeed, he was present, slumped backward in a work chair before a great board made of slate, a piece of chalk still clenched in his hand. Gix's mechanical eyes swept the room. It was filled with books, most of which were covered in a thick coating of dust. At the far side, near a heavy wooden throne, another man, a Fallagy guard, was asleep. Gix nodded. One less being he would have to kill immediately. He moved toward the inert form of the sleeping Mishra. The human looked almost cherubic in slumber. His beard was now flecked with bits of grey, and his hair was cropped at the neckline behind him. Mishra was wider now than he had been when he had entered Phyrexia, the excess weight spilling over his belt line. There were small wrinkles beside his eyes, and lines stretched across his forehead. The crown of rulership had rested heavily on that head. But Gix could sense an alertness about the man, even in slumber. His mind was working, dreaming of new devices and new plans. Even in rest there was the sense of motion about him. The demon would have to move quietly. Originally Gix had thought to merely excise the top of the man's head and scoop the brains out slowly, to make Mishra aware of what was happening to him before he perished. Now, seeing the man think even when asleep, Gix decided to merely slash his throat and take the power stone for himself. The power stone. It lay within a small pouch hanging from around Mishra's neck. Gix could feel the crystal's presence, just as he could feel Mishra's, or feel the automaton's heart. The ordinary human across the room was a statue, a lump of earth by comparison. Both Mishra and his stone exuded a sense of power that Gix could almost taste. The demon held up a finger, and a single needle-sharp talon extruded from his fingertip. He leaned forward. One swift cut, he thought, along the base of the jawline, from ear to ear. There was a noise, a humming so soft that only Gix could hear it. Beneath the folds of the human's vest, within its pouch, the gem began to glow in rainbow colors. It flickered to life of its own volition, the colors spilling from the gathered opening of the bag and bathing Mishra in its light. Gix froze for a moment, and not of his own will. The stone was aware of him as he was aware of it. Somehow it could prevent him from carrying out his plan. He pressed a hand forward, and with every inch progress became more difficult, until at last it was like pressing through forged iron, solid and unrelenting. Gix shook his head in puzzlement. There was no indication earlier that the stone offered any personal protection to its holder. Yet he could not lean forward and end this one's life. The demon changed his goal. He would take the gem itself and then kill the human for his insult. The gem seemed to sense Gix's intent and flashed brightly as the demon reached for its pouch. Gix pulled his hand back and let out a hissing curse. The stone's proximity had burned him like acid, and wisps of smoke rose from his scalded hands. Across the room, the other human stirred in his sleep. Gix tucked the burned hand under his arm, muttering in a clicking tongue of the pain. Gix looked at the slumbering Mishra and let out a low, cat-like hiss. The stone offered some protection to itself and its user, at least from creatures such as the Phyrexian. It burned him as he approached. No, not burned, thought the demon. It was attempting to recognize him and to dominate him, to command him, as it had commanded the dragon engines years earlier. The stone, though itself unthinking, recognized his sentience, and it rejected him as dangerous. That rejection was the burning GIX perched on the edge of the work table. The stone protected the man. The stone protected the stone while in the man's possession. GIX thought about it for a few moments, then smiled. The answer was to change the nature of the stone, or to change the nature of the man. The stone was half of its original, and perhaps its protective nature stemmed from that cleaving. It was seeking its mate, thought GIX. Perhaps it had somehow determined that Mishra was its opposing half. That would explain the wards that kept a Phyrexian creature such as himself at bay. Unify the halves, and the entire crystal would be restored. GIX could take it back to his homeland. And the man. GIX looked at the sleeping Mishra. Perhaps he could be changed as well, or altered to something that would serve Gix's masters better as a live slave than as a dead example. Yes. It would take time, but GIX had little but time. Mishra was separated from his fellow humans by his intelligence, by his position, and by his power. Could GIX recruit him, and his brother for that matter, into his world? Would that not be a more fitting punishment than just killing them? GIX let a lipless smile spread across his face. Yes, there were more ways to kill a creature than just by ending its life. Sometimes all you had to do was give it what it wanted. GIX tilted his head back and barked a short string of clicking syllables. Within his body, small alterations were made, and he called out to the machines in the caverns of Koilos. They answered his call and pulled him back to their warmth and comfort. In an instant he was gone. In Mishra's workshop, Haja stirred and inwardly cursed for allowing himself to drift off. The preparations for relocating to Tomikul had drained the life from him as well as from Master Mishra. Haja padded over to where Mishra was sleeping, still seated in one of his chairs. His vest had come open, and the pouch containing his talisman, his multicolored stone, lay on his shirt. Haja smiled and tucked the pouch back within Mishra's shirt, covering the Qadir of the Phalange with a blanket. The guard blinked and sniffed the air. There was an odor present, a mixture of burning coal and machine oil, probably the result of a wind shifting its bearings and blowing over some sulfur pit or workroom. Haja shook his head. He for one would be glad when they were quit of this place and back under the desert sky. He checked the doors to make sure they were locked, then retreated back to his own position and drifted back to sleep, dreaming of that desert. In their quarters, the Brotherhood of GIX dreamed as well. Dreams sent by the Masters. There were new orders, said the dreams, and it would require that they serve in Mishra's court longer than had been planned. But the rewards would be great once they succeeded. All the dreams in Mishra's encampment that night were pleasant. Chapter 24. The Third Path. Lauren moved down the curved hallway of the tower with practiced grace. For the first year of her tenancy among the ivory towers, she had regularly gotten lost, for the corridors and walls were not straight but rather curved to fill their outer shape. Slowly she had stopped thinking in terms of north and south, and instead estimated in terms of distance from the tower's center and the angle from the entrance. Now the towers were no longer an enigma to her. The Archimandrite had noticed her growing assuredness. Of course she seemed to notice everything and congratulated her on the matter. Drafna still rises from meetings and heads for the wrong door, she said. Drafna was confused by many things but proved to be brilliant. With artifacts, he could postulate an entire artifact from the merest scraps and was rarely incorrect in his assessment. As he pored over Takesha's notes, he occasionally reminded Lauren of the young Urza and Mishra, so intent was his desire for understanding. On a daily level, Drafna proved to be a trial. He regularly disagreed with whatever the majority seemed to prefer. Were it not for Hercule, he would have left the Union long ago. Hercule held the leash, and Lauren soon realized many of Drafna's discoveries were in fact made by her and only relayed through the balding scholar. She was a timid woman, almost to the point of being invisible. In the 3 years Lauren had been at Teresia City, she had heard the woman complete a full sentence only 3 times. In many ways, Hercule reminded Lauren of herself as a young woman. City life seemed to agree with Hercule. She, her husband, and all their students back on Latnam apparently had shaved their heads because the school was mostly underground, and shaving of all body hair kept the light at bay. Since staying at the ivory towers of Teresia City, Hercule had allowed her hair to grow out and proved to have thick, luxurious tresses that caught the light like strands of obsidian cord. Drafna had returned to Latnam several times, but Hercule always remained. The Archimandrite was the center of the Union, but Hercule was one of the keystones of that group, as well as Feldin, and, despite himself, Drafna and Lauren had come to recognize herself as well. The halls were full of lesser scribes and scholars as she wended her way to Feldin's private sanctuary. The city was quickly becoming a refuge for those individuals who saw their work threatened elsewhere. Most were from the lands bordering the Fallagy Empire, but there were numerous expatriates from Zegon, Tomikul, and other Mishra-held cities. To Lauren's surprise, there were some from Corlus and Yosha as well, and some dwarves from the Sardian Mountains who did not trust Urza and the Argivians. There had also been an infusion of charlatans, tricksters, hoaxers, and outright frauds. Yet for every 3 such con men and con women, there was an individual who carried a useful device, an old scroll, or something that added to the growing body of knowledge kept in the tower. Lauren would have evicted the lot of them, but the Archimandrite had taken them in, and the Union was stronger for it. Then there was the Brotherhood of Gix. Their order of black-robed monks venerated some sort of machine god, which should have made him invaluable in working with ancient artifacts. But their love of the artifacts approached fetishism, and they were continually judging both the artifacts and those who used them. To those careless enough to ask, they explained at length that they held Urza and Mishra both unworthy of the great devices they had built, and believed the two would be punished for the effrontery. The Brotherhood left little doubt that it had the same opinion of Drafna and herself. As a group, they seemed to be holding something back as well, listening to everyone but saying little in response save to offer praises to the machine. Feldin had brought back with him some seers from Saranthant, shamans and witch priests from the Umok nations of the mountainous northern coast. These last were heavy men with sallow skins, sweating profusely beneath their furs and seal-hide capes. Lauren could see why Feldin got along with them, for both he and the Umok priests were uncomfortable in the warmth of Teresia City. The Archimandrite brought the scholars and librarians of her city. They ranged in quality and temperament from enthusiastic bibliophiles to hidebound book straighteners. The latter would rather than let anyone open the cherished tomes and risk the information within escaping. Still, with kind words and a steely will, the Archimandrite pried their holy texts from their hands. There was one bitter disappointment. The song mages of Sumifa refused the offer of the Union. Instead, they had thrown in with Mishra and were using the skills in his service. "I don't see why that's a problem," Drafna said upon getting the news. The Suma fans, all Almazians for that matter, and irritating people at best. Their language is filled with trills and warbles, and it's hard to understand them. "They have a version of old knowledge," said the Archimandrite calmly. "The songs carry some sort of power, which allows them to calm, and to some degree control, savage beasts." "Hokum," snorted Drafna. "Perhaps," responded Lauren, "but there might be truth behind the claims, some natural effect we are missing. There might be something we can learn from, if there is anything at the core of the teachings," said Drafna. "It is wrapped under so much folderol and mummery that it's generally useless to us. Like that machine god, the Gixians. Now there's a bad lot creepy fanatics with delusions of mechanical utopia. They're just not all here." The scholar tapped his bald pate repeatedly for emphasis. Feldon usually started frowning the moment Drafna opened his mouth. Now he slapped the table with an open hand. "Don't dismiss the song mages out of hand. Just because we don't understand a phenomenon doesn't mean it doesn't exist." Drafna turned frosty. "I find it hard to believe that music truly calms the savage breast, that's all. I find it hard to believe in men flying in Thran artifacts," snapped Feldon. "Or in mechanical dragons, for that matter. But we live in a world where they exist, and I, for one, want to be prepared for them." Now, at Feldon's door, that conversation came back to Lauren. Feldon and Drafna had become opposite poles in their discussions. Was that why Feldon had asked her to come to his personal study, as opposed to bringing something before the entire group? She knocked, and a heavy voice bade her enter. Feldon's study was sparse in a low table piled with books in an orderly fashion, a few chairs around a low table, and a small slate board along the wall. The room was lit by a single window. The heavy bear of a man was seated before the table, which was clear but for one item. "Did you hear the news?" Lauren asked as she entered. Feldon glanced up with a haggard look. "About Yosha. Drafna told me about it at breakfast. It's ancient history already." Lauren nodded. "Even rumors took the time traversing the length of the Phalange Empire. But some refugees from Zegon had arrived in the city the previous evening with important news. Urza had made his move across the Corliss-Yoshan border and was liberating cities from the overmatched Phalange." "Ancient history," said Feldon. "By the time the news reaches us, what's his name could be in Tomikul, or have been stopped by a counter-offensive," noted Lauren. "But you did not ask me up here to discuss the news from the battlefronts. What's wrong? What do you make of this?" the lame man asked, motioning Lauren forward. "You mock fishermen brought it up with their nets. The same group that delivered that coral helmet a year ago. It was a cross between a bowl mounted on a thick pedestal and a squat, wide-rimmed goblet. The bowl was about a foot across, with a pair of heavy handles mounted on each side. The bowl appeared copperish, but it was unlike any copper Lauren had seen before. The device reminded Lauren of a sacrificial bowl used by the old religions of Argive. "It's called a silix," said Felden, his eyes not leaving the bowl. "At least that's what it calls itself. And it's from Golgoth, which I've never heard of either." "You know what it is?" asked Lauren. Felden tipped the bowl toward Lauren. The interior of the bowl, which would normally be smooth, was covered with small, incised figures that seemed to spiral before her eyes from the rim into the base. "Its purpose is written on it," said Felden. Lauren narrowed her eyes. "These are Thran glyphs," she said. At last. Felden nodded. "I can't read those characters," he said, then pointed to another curving line of characters. "But these are fallagy characters, written in an arcane style that I can read. These resemble the song markings of the Sumer fans, and these match the incisions on my cane. These," he pointed to a few other lines, "are unlike anything I've ever seen. Do you know what they mean?" "A way of reading Thran," said Lauren. "A master cipher to a host of old languages." Felden smiled. "Indeed. If only the message it bore was not so grim." Lauren raised an eyebrow. "And it is." Felden leaned forward over the bowl. "I don't have all of it, but I think I have most of it. It's called a silix, and it's from Golgoth, as I said. Whether Golgoth is a land, a king, or its maker, I have no idea. It is supposed to herald the end of the world." Lauren looked at Felden and said nothing. Felden shook his head. "I know what you're thinking. Mummery and claptrap. That's one reason I didn't bring it forward to the others. Drafna thinks I'm going to start hanging strands of burning incense and spinning prayer wheels any day now. But listen to the translation of the archaic fallagy: wipe the land clear, bring the ending, topple the empires to bring a fresh start, and this call the end, fill with memories of the land." Single quote. "Sounds pretty dense." "Fill with memories," said Lauren. "Sounds like something out if charlatans patter. Old magics that require the whisper of a dying sun and the smile of a cat. And wasn't there an old fallagy legend of a city in a bottle, which survived when the rest of the world was to be destroyed?" Felden looked up. "You don't believe it, then?" Lauren shook her head. "I think this is a wondrous find, which will unlock many other mysteries for us. Perhaps it carries some warning of an ancient time. But no, I don't believe it." "Touch it," said Felden, leaning away from the bowl. "Go ahead, touch it." Lauren reached out and grasped the side of the bowl. There was an instant feeling of disquiet, as if the sun had suddenly passed behind a cloud, leaving her in shadow. She looked up, and the entire room seemed to have dimmed. Out of that dimness, she thought she heard a cry, the plaintive lament of a young child, though so faint that it was almost below her ability to discern. She released the bowl's edge, and the world returned to normal. The sun passed from behind the cloud, and the child's cry was gone entirely. "You felt it too," said Felden. Lauren nodded and sat down opposite Felden, the silix between them. "There is something here. Something we don't understand yet," said Felden. "Is it a warning or a weapon? But what does it mean?" asked Lauren. "Fill with memories. Has Hercule taught you any of her meditative techniques?" inquired Felden. "She's taught the Archimandrite, who's passed a bit on to me," said Lauren. But there are a number of meditative techniques used by scholars to focus attention and concentration, ranging from the songsmiths of Sumefa to... Felden interrupted her with a hasty wave of the hand. But Hercule, our silent compatriot, what of her meditations? The Archimandrite said she sits in the morning and thinks of her home in Latnam, of the azure-colored waves, white with froth, suspended over the shore before crashing down. I think it calms her to think of home, said Lauren. While it is fresh in her mind, it keeps her from needing to return to her island. Anything else? Asked Felden. Lauren shrugged. There have been some interesting incidents, she said. The Archimandrite mentions that after her meditating sessions, Hercule's quarters become neater. The books are shelved in their proper order, and her stylia back in their case. No one remembers putting them away, of course. You believe that? Said the bearer of a man gruffly. I think we need to research the matter further, returned Lauren. If it were anyone else but Hercule, Drafna would be shouting from the parapets that it was all bunk and hokum. Yes, nodded Felden. But have you tried the techniques? Have you thought about your homeland? Lauren shrugged again. I don't really want to think about Argive at the moment, or what is happening there. Yes, I suppose so, said the bearish scholar. I'm going to have to learn that technique, I suppose. Sounds like it might be akin to filling something with memories of the land. Lauren did not answer but looked at the bowl. She reached out for a moment but did not touch it again. Felden said, if it is a weapon, is it one the brothers could use? Lauren shook her head. I don't think so. There is no mechanism here, no set of weights and cables, no obvious source of its power. All there is a warning and the bad feeling that surrounds it. Felden nodded. I agree. And yet why do I feel so loath to tell the others about it? Lauren concurred with the feeling. Tell the Archimandrite it. Least, she said. And make a parchment rubbing of the interior. The translations within will prove invaluable to our work. Then put it in a safe place, secure from any would-be thieves. Just in case it is what it says it is. Felden nodded again, but his eyes were on the silex. It's a little tempting, though, isn't it? Wiping everything clear and starting again. Lauren rose and paused at the door. Yes, she said, but your glaciers would probably melt. And then what would study? Felden allowed himself a weak smile. You speak the voice of reason. No matter how bad things are now between Mishra and what's his name, it hasn't gotten all that bad yet. Lauren smiled as well and left Felden to his studies. Outside the room, in the curved hallway, she touched the hand that had held the bowl. It was numb, and feeling was only now starting to return to it. She flexed her fingers and tried to will the nerves to respond. Lauren shook her head. It hadn't gotten all that bad. Chapter 25. Rack. Tawnos was in chains. A set of manacles bound his wrists no more than a foot apart, and a second set similarly constrained his ankles. The chains of the manacles were gathered together at his midsection, where another, longer chain secured the entire collection to a large iron ring in the floor. He could not stand up fully, much less move comfortably. Not that there was much room to move in or places to go if he could. The room was without furniture save for a single stool. A grate above allowed in some diffuse light on an irregular schedule, and another grate in the floor carried away waste. A single iron door with a shutter was set along one wall. A human skull leered in the corner, the remains of a previous occupant. Other than that, nothing. Nothing but him and his chains. A pity, really, thought Tawnos, because the war had been going so well up to that point. Mishra had spread himself too thin, and the combined kingdoms of Argive and Tawnos took advantage of the weakness. Mishra managed to hold the northern passes well enough, but the defenses into Yosha were threadbare at best. Raiding from the combined kingdoms intensified, until finally a group of Tawlosian volunteers were trapped in Yosha and massacred. The martyrs of Tawnos were noteworthy for both their youth and the fact that they were not in the pay of anyone else. Instead, they were true patriots of their nation, the sons and daughters of merchant lords. The slaughter electrified the southern of the two united countries, and demands rang out to the combined king to take action immediately. It had happened as Tawnos had predicted, before Urza was ready, but later than Tawnos himself had anticipated. The Lord Protector had sufficient manpower to throw his machinery south, without seriously depleting the northern passes. With most of Mishra's forces heading west to Saranth, no one expected a strike against Argive. There were strikes, of course, but they were badly planned and hastily launched and dealt with by the forces at hand. Instead, a full army of Argivians and newly patriotic coalitions headed south and west, backed by ornithopters, Yoshan soldiers, a variety of Avengers, including the new Sentinel model, Triskelions, and a four-part flying creature called the Tetravis. The legions spilled over the borders and interoccupied Yosha. The Falange garrisons were not enough to hold the borders, but sufficient to offer more than token resistance and prevent a quick campaign. The Falange began a regular retreat over the next year, withdrawing from one province to strike in another. They burned the territories to which they never intended to return. By the fall of the first year, the areas south of the wreckage of Krug were freed from Falange rulership, if not their raids. This included Joralan and the other coastal cities. By the end of next year, the Falange had been driven from most of Yosha, with the exception of the Transmardan provinces and the sword marches. 7 enemy dragon engines had been destroyed in the process in pitched battles that tested Urza's machines to the utmost. The land was wrecked by the despoiling Falange and the wars of liberation, but it was retaken at last. Tawnos rode at the head of the army through the streets of recovered towns to cheers to hard eyes as well, for those who had suffered under the Falange and wondered what the former queen was doing, safe and secure in Pendragon. They got their answer soon enough. Yosha was incorporated into the combined kingdoms of Tawnos and Argive, without so much as asking the newly freed people. The queen would not return, and Yosha would be a vassal state for the unified kingdoms. After more than 10 years of war, Yosha had traded one master for another. Tawnos understood this at the time. He knew it was the only way to convince the Argivian nobles and Tawlosian merchant lords to help mend the shattered landscape and feed a population whose fields had been burned by the retreating Falange. But the part of him that was Yoshan did not like it, and it was clear others felt the same way. There was a similar reaction to the Lord Protector's next decision. The people assumed that Urza would clear out the rest of the provinces, restoring a complete Yosha. Instead, he eschewed retaking the sword marches of his father-in-law. The army massed for an assault across the Marden, making for Tomekul itself. The Yotians muttered and talked about the Corliss merchants, and how the coalitions lusted to regain their protected trade routes to beyond Tomekul. Tawnos knew better. Mishra had apparently made Tomekul his base of operations, and Urza was coming for his brother. The procedure was slow, methodical, and utterly relentless. The advance was held to 30 miles a day, though some of the automatons could travel further than that. At every night stop, one of Urza's towers was erected, fitted with great mirrors and signal fires to communicate with its neighbors. A permanent garrison was stationed of men and machines, and the remainder pressed on. As they pressed westward, the resistance stiffened, and more manpower was called for. From his headquarters in Penregan, Urza was finally forced to weaken the passes in order to supply the main assault. In addition, the Lord Protector hired mercenary units, promising plunder when Tomekul fell. The coalitions were nervous about the decision to offer Tomekul to the sword, but since most of the mercenaries were theirs, they abided by it. By this time Tawnos was leading the army westward, though officially in a capacity advisory to General Sharaman. Tawnos knew the strengths and weakness of his machines, and the general trusted Tawnos's judgment sufficiently to translate the master scholar's advice into orders. They were within sight of the great golden domes of Tomekul when everything fell apart. Falange cavalry had struck along the length of the supply line throughout the march, and on several occasions had taken a tower, forcing part of the army to double back to re-establish their lines of communications. At first the attacks had been sporadic, but now they were almost continual. Indeed, Tawnos blamed the defeat in part on the regular nature of those attacks. The Argivians had been inured to the continual raiding, and as a result they didn't realize the nature of the assaults had changed. Tawnos also blamed the defeat on lack of adequate information. Saranth's capital had fallen as they pressed west after years of siege, and no one told the Argivian force. Most of the Scythian countryside was still in revolt, but the nation's great walled city had finally fallen, and troops previously tied down in siege were now flooding south, bearing down on Tawnos's column. Urza had taken too long to arrive at Tomekul, and Mishra now had the opportunity to respond in force. First were the dragon engines. Mishra had lashed together at least a dozen, most of those clanking imitations, plus 2 of the ones that had leveled Krug. These moved like panthers and struck without mercy. There was also a new type, one that could fly, and it scattered the ornithopters like sparrows before a hawk. Then there were the transmogrants, zombie-like beings that had once been men but now were shambling engines of destruction. These bunched up against their assailants, and Tawnos's clay statues were slaughtered in droves. The transmogrants had been taught to pull the clay from the statues' forms, like ants cleaning a carcass. The amorphous clay had not the chance to regather itself. Neither did the Argivian army. From its position farthest forward, it was driven back to post after post, retreating, fighting, then retreating again. Word arrived that new Corlissian mercenaries were coming up the line, bringing with them the mechanical garrisons from the previous hours. The reinforcements never materialized. Instead, the retreating Argivian forces found one of the towers in the hands of Mishra's cavalry who had flanked the line of march and now bore down on the remains of Shahraman's force with Urza's own automatons. The field was covered in blood and resounded with the screams of the valiant and the dying. Tawnos held his own for a short while, surrounded by a pair of his clay statues. He formed one island of an archipelago of Argivian defenders, ringed by falange, swordsmen and unliving opponents. The sky belonged to flying engines of destruction. Then there was an explosion and darkness. He woke in the dark of the pit. He had been bruised badly, particularly around the face, but was otherwise unharmed. He had now been conscious several days by his own count, and except for an unspeaking guard who slapped a bowl of gruel-thin porridge before him, there had been no visitors. There was a soft clicking noise as the shutter to the iron door slid open. A flash of dark eyes sparkled on the other side, and it slid back. Then the door was open. Tawnos winced at the brightness. Several figures stood in the doorway, silhouettes against the light beyond them. The foremost strode into the cell and removed her gloves. She wore spiked armor. "Hello, Duck," said Ashnod. "I hope you've enjoyed your quarters. It's not much, but it's better than you deserve." "It's called an oubliette," she said as two guards brought in furniture. It's apparently an old falange tradition from back when they took prisoners on a regular basis. A dimly lit cell, perfect for making personal enemies disappear. Tomikul is tunneled with them. We had to clear some of the bones out of this one so we could put you here. The skull was left as a reminder. Its owner starved here, ignored by the guards and abandoned by her captors. The guards brought in a heavy chair with thick pillows for padding. Ashnod sat herself gently down on the pillows. The guards placed a small table before her. The table had claw-like legs that gripped the rough stone floor. Ashnod tried to shake the table, and when it did not move she nodded her approval. The table was fitted with a single manacle. One of Tawnos's hands, the right one, was freed of his wrist cuff and forced it dagger point through the table-mounted manacle, palm upward. The guards fastened the cuff shut with iron pins, and two of them left. One remained. "There are those among the falange who want you dead," said Ashnod. "They're fortunately outnumbered by the ones who want you to suffer a long time first." She pulled from her bag a circular device looking like a flat plate, to which an odd set of struts and wires had been attached. She slid the plate forward beneath Tawnos's right hand. The remaining guard placed the dagger's edge against Tawnos's throat. As Ashnod attached small clamps to each of his fingertips, the clamps drew blood as they pricked his flesh. Tawnos waited until the dagger had been withdrawn from his neck, then said, "And which group do you represent?" His lips felt like lumps from the earlier unknown beating. "As always, I represent myself," the red-haired woman said, throwing a knife-edge switch before her. Tawnos convulsed as a charge of energy passed up his hand and into his body. He nearly fell from his stool, but his hand was firmly manacled to the table, and the table was firmly set on the floor. He twisted and turned as the current ran through his body. Ashnod tripped open the switch. "It works," she said. Tawnos gasped. "What is?" Ashnod replied, "The falange have a number of traditional tortures. Rack, thumbscrew, and Urza Mishra had worked his own version of the rack years ago, designed to cause maximum discomfort for minimum effort. This she patted the device that had ensnared his hand. Is a smaller version of my own rack. Like it. Love it, gasped Tawnos. Fits you perfectly. Why don't you just kill me? That's one option, said Ashnod. One I don't want to be forced into. Ashnod, said Tawnos, when you were our prisoner, we treated you well. Here's a hint, duck, said Ashnod. By fallagy standards, this is being treated well. Most of your compatriots have been killed. Mishra doesn't even trust Yoshan slaves anymore. He thinks Urza can read their minds at a distance. Mishra wanted to deliver your head, pickled, to Mama Duck Urza. I talked him out. If it said you had knowledge we could use. I won't tell you anything, spat Tawnos. I know, said Ashnod calmly. But it was either this or the pickling jar. Why tell me this? Growled Tawnos. In the hopes I'll tell you something useful. In part, said Ashnod. And with your friend listening? Asked Tawnos. Ashnod shook her head. Understanding Argivian is considered to be a black mark in the Fallagy armed forces these days. Watch. She turned to the guard and said clearly, I turned your father into a transmogrant. And your grandfather and your brother too. Because they were insufficient bedmates. The guard said nothing. Ashnod turned back. See. If I said the same thing in Fallagy, he'd be after my blood. She turned to the guard and barked out a command in the desert language. The guard started to protest in the same tongue, and Ashnod shouted at him again. The guard hesitated, glowered at Tawnos, then left the cell. The door swung shut behind him. The shutter opened briefly, then closed. Now you have to do me a favor, said Ashnod. I'm at your disposal, said Tawnos bitterly. My back is to the door, she said. And I figure our guards will be checking regularly on my progress with you. So when the shutter opens, give me the high sign and I'll give you a little dose. Why would I do that? Said Tawnos. Because if you don't, I'll have to zap you randomly just to keep up appearances, she said, and threw the knife switch again. Tawnos's body stiffened as the charge roared up his arm. The secret word is traitor, okay? Easy to remember, said Tawnos. Just stop doing that. Oh come on, said Ashnod with a smile. This is nothing close to a lethal dose for a man your size and age. Trust me, I know. I believe you, said Tawnos. Those transmogrants, the zombie men, they're yours, aren't they? What do you think? She said, smiling. They're horrible, said Tawnos. Ashnod's smile flickered for just a moment, and when it returned there was a forced feeling about it. I thought you would understand, of anyone. They were once living men, hissed Tawnos. Emphasis on once, returned Ashnod. They were criminals. Slaves, prisoners, people they were going to kill and leave out. For the vultures anyway. I found a use for them. Traitor, snapped Tawnos quickly. Ashnod threw the switch, and another bolt of energy blasted through Tawnos's arm and shoulder. It seemed to him that she left. The switch closed for slightly longer than she needed to. When Tawnos recovered, she continued. The desert has only two resources. The Thran relics are one, and Mishra has gone as far as he can with them. The other is people. They're a resource too. Tawnos said nothing. I'm not afraid to get my hands dirty, said Ashnod. Or bloody, added Tawnos angrily. Her hand hovered over the switch, then pulled back. We don't have all the wealth of the Eastern nations, she said, defensively. We have to make do with what we have. You don't take care of what you have, said Tawnos. When Ashnod looked at him, confused, he said, you've stripped Yosha to the ground. Ashnod's eyes lowered. Yes. That. I argued against that, too, but Mishra overruled me there. That ever happened with Urza? Tawnos hesitated for a moment, then nodded. More often than I want to think about. Why was it a bad idea? Didn't I just agree with you? Asked Ashnod. Yes, said Tawnos, but I probably won't like your reason. Why? Because it's a waste of resources, said Ashnod. Of material and manpower we might have held and used later. Thought as much, said Tawnos. Traitor. Another flip of the switch, though this one was not as long as previous. Nevertheless, Tawnos was sure that his heart had stammered in its beating in the middle of the jolt. But you were overruled, continued Tawnos, when he could breath again. Said Ashnod. Mishra's been putting distance between the two of us for years now. He wants my transmogrants, my battle armor, and my other creations, but he doesn't want to be seen as depending on me. It's a sign of weakness among the fansThe, and even after all these years he depends on their support. The other chieftains, said Tawnos, guessing whom she meant. And others, returned Ashnod. He has an aide from way back, who's like his second shadow. And then there's the Gixians. They would just love to go pawing through my notes. Gixians? Inquired Tawnos. The Brotherhood of GIX. Machine worshippers. Yeah, grunted Ashnod. Nasty little creatures. They're in the Argivian court as well, said Tawnos. Your spies? Ashnod shrugged. Don't know. They may be playing both sides against the center. I don't trust 'em. Nor one, agreed Tawnos. Less now that I know they're working with Urza's brother as well. Traitors. Another throw of the knife switch, and Tawnos yelped. Finally, he said, I don't know if I can take much more of this. Agreed, said Ashnod. And we've spent long enough for me to claim you'll be a very hard nut to crack. Loyal unto death to Marmaduke Urza and all that. So they will kill me now, spat Tawnos. Was that what all this was? One last chance to taunt me. One last chance to see if you're as smart as I am, said Ashnod sharply, and one more chance to embarrass the others on whom Mishra depends so heavily. If everything goes well, a chance to have you owe me a favor. A girl can never be owed too many favors. I don't understand you, said Tawnos. You'll, said Ashnod, if you're as smart as I think you are. For now, this discussion is over. She flicked the switch shut again, and the pain radiated through Tawnos's body until finally the darkness swallowed him. Tawnos did not know how long she kept the charge going, but by the time he recovered, the guards were back in the room and he had been freed from the table and its device. His right hand was a tight ball of pain as they refastened his original chains. But you didn't ask anything, he gasped. About the artifacts. Ashnod knelt beside him and hissed, I don't need to ask anything. We have the remains of your precious artifacts. They will tell me more about Urza and you than a year and day of torture would. Then she was gone, and the room was in darkness again. For a long time he sat in the shadows, mastering his racing heart and his labored breathing. Once the shutter in the door opened, then shut again after an unseen watcher determined Ashnod had not killed him. Tawnos slowly opened his hand. Clenched tightly in his palm were two of Ashnod's earrings and a spool of golden wire. The gemstones in the earrings glowed with their own internal light. She wanted him to prove he was as smart as she was, he thought. Tawnos allowed himself a smile and crawled over to the skull that had been left in his cell. Ashnod was summoned to Mishra's court in the palace of the old Pasha of Tomikul. It was a month after her discussion with Tawnos, and 3 days after she had filed a final report on Tawnos's artifacts. There were definitely design components she could incorporate into her own work. She did not find Mishra at his workbench. Instead, he was seated on the former Pasha's throne, patting his fingertips together. Slowly. Ashnod had been surprised by Mishra's appearance when she first returned from Sarinth. The man had let his waistline grow, and there were jowls beneath the silver-flecked beard. He was decked in his desert robes, billowing things that made him seem all the fatter. He had tucked into his belt the symbol of Sarinth, itself a razor-sharp ankh. The strain of the war was telling on him, thought Ashnod. He had been afraid of his brother's response for years, and when it finally came, he beat it back. Now he was afraid of the next assault. Beside the throne and slightly behind it was Haja, trusty and silent as ever. On the other side was one of the Gixians, repulsive priest with a hunchback and mismatched eyes. Ashnod knelt, then rose to hear Mishra's words. Tawnos escaped his dungeon cell 5 nights ago, he said quietly. Ashnod frowned. Why was I not informed? She said hotly. Has he been found? Not yet, said Mishra. And no one told me, snapped Ashnod. I might have aided the pursuit or hindered it, said the Gixian. Ashnod gave the priest a look that clearly showed she was sizing him up for the transmogrant tank. What do you mean? Mishra answered instead. An accusation has been made about your involvement in this matter. My, said Ashnod, letting her voice trail off in astonishment. Who makes such wild accusations? Mishra said nothing, but the Gixian priest laughed. It was a nervous, clicking chuckle. You did meet with the escaped prisoner, said Mishra. Finally. Once, said Ashnod hotly. Almost a month ago. On your orders. To ascertain whether he would break under the rack. I quickly determined that he would not and left him there to rot. It was there in my report. Of course, said Mishra smoothly, waving aside her comment. And the report. The fact of the matter is Tawnos made his escape by means of a device similar to your own staff. Pardon. Ashnod wondered if she was acting sufficiently surprised by the news. A device that weakened his guard, continued Mishra. A device that allowed him to immobilize a patrol that he had almost snared him. A device similar to that which you used against me once before at the walls of Zegon. That proves nothing, said Ashnod, then took a deep breath. I was relieved of my own stuff when I was captured in Krug. Tawnos could have examined it then and prepared himself for the eventuality of capture. It is not my fault if your guards did not search him sufficiently. "And your conversation," said Mishra, ignoring her words. "Very unusual interrogation technique. My methods have been suited to your needs before," said Ashnod, but she felt a cold chill run down her back. Had one of the guards been able to understand them? As if reading her mind, Mishra said, while the guard spoke. Only fallagy, to prevent him from communicating with the prisoner. They did have fairly good memories. Their recitation of the words proved interesting. They did not understand any of the words, so the translation was garbled, but they paid special attention whenever you mention my name. The cold chill became a winter blast. Ashnod said, "If you do not trust me, master, next time send along a guard who speaks the prisoner's language. I am sure there were mistakes in what they heard and reported to you." "I would be inclined to believe you," said Mishra, "were it not for one last piece of evidence." "Priest, if you please." The Gixian chuckled and held out his hand. In his palm were the setting to a pair of earrings. The gemstones had been removed. "Found them in the sewers beneath the cell," said the priest, with a giggle. "Amazing what people lose," said Ashnod coldly. "Indeed," said Mishra, looking over Ashnod's shoulder now. "They look similar to a set I've seen you wear. Except those are now missing. And these are missing the power stones that would have been at the centers." Ashnod opened her mouth and shut it. Mishra's mind had been made up before Ashnod arrived at the door, and he'd paid not the slightest heed to anything she had said. Even were she innocent of the accusations, the circumstances damned her. And she was not innocent. "My lord," she said, switching tactics, "were you aware there are members of the Brotherhood of Gix in Urza's court?" Mishra's face was calm, but there was the barest twitch of his lips at the mention of his brother's name. Instead he said, "You know that from your interrogation of my brother's student." "Yes," said Ashnod. "Was that in your original report of the interrogation?" asked Mishra, his eyes narrowing. Ashnod realized her mistake. While claiming her honesty and innocence, she had revealed there were things she had not reported. She kept her face emotionless and said, "I did not want to make wild accusations." She nodded at the priests without proof. "And do you have proof?" said Mishra. "I was waiting for confirmation from other sources," said Ashnod, "but thought you had best know of it now." "I know of it," said Mishra, "because the good priest here has informed me of the situation, which you had not. You've made the case for them." Ashnod grasped at straws. "Surely I am not to be singled out because a prisoner escapes." "You are not," said Mishra shortly. "There are the guards," said Ashnod. "They're already dead," said Mishra, "at my command." Ashnod paused for a moment. "I see. And my fate?" She looked at Mishra and thought she saw his face soften, but only for an instant. "You are banished." "Most revered one, I," started Ashnod. "Banished," said Mishra, slightly louder. The priest giggled and rubbed his hands together. "Yes," Ashnod thought bitterly, the Gixians had the pause in this from start to finish. "Urza would not treat his apprentice so shabbily," said Ashnod hotly. As soon as the words left her lips, she knew they were a mistake. Mishra's face burst into an emotional storm. "What my brother would or would not do is no concern of yours," he thundered. Ashnod felt the force of the words like hammer blows. Mishra leaned back in his chair. The momentary storm had abated, but the fire was still in his eyes. "You are banished." For this court and from the Fallagy Empire. Leave now. If you are found anywhere within my lands after sunup, you'll be put to death. Slowly. Am I clear? Ashnod looked into Mishra's face, then nodded. As glass, she said. She bowed low and retreated from the throne room. She stormed through the halls, making for her quarters. No. She realized the rest of the Brotherhood was already there. Going through her notes and books, stripping her lab of her personal discoveries, looting her possessions. They would like nothing better than to delay her, then to claim Mishra's order as a chance to get rid of her once and for all. Instead, she went to the stables and took her favorite horse, the black charger that had carried her from the battlefield in Corliss. She took only the clothes on her back and the knowledge in her mind that would have to be enough. She rode out of the Pasha's royal complex and reined the horse in. The street led east and west. East to a road, most likely watched, or west to the unknown. She pulled the horse's reins and began the long trek to the west, to Terizia City and the lands outside either of the brothers' control. The guard at the gate noted her decision and informed the priest of Gix who had asked him to keep an eye out. The priest reported to his superior, who whispered it to Mishra. Mishra merely nodded and began to plan the next campaign of his glorious empire. Chapter 26. Clockworks. Tawnos almost made it to the border before the Makfar were caught up with him. He had almost expected it. He had been extremely lucky so far, and he knew that luck would run out sometime. After his escape, he had cut north and east across the desert, making for the passes of Argive instead of following the route of ruined towers back to Yosha. That had shaken the immediate pursuers. He spent some time among the Scythian refugees on the shores of the Marden, but traveled mostly alone and at night. He rode by the soft light of the mist moon when he could, and by the erratic sputtering of the glimmer moon if its larger sibling was not in the sky. Neither moon had been aloft the previous evening. And close to his goal, Tawnos decided to risk traveling by day. He had almost lost his horse and his life to one of Mishra's inventions earlier in the day. The creation was some sort of reactive device, similar to Urza's sentinels. In this case, the device lay beneath the sands, waiting for a trespasser. As Tawnos rode through the device's domain, the sand around him began to chum, like water coming to a boil. Tawnos tried to rein in the beast, but the horse bolted, taking the scholar with it. He was lucky again. Had he stayed, Tawnos would have been trapped. Metallic coils and saw-toothed arms erupted from the sands, flailing blindly in all directions. A rasping shriek rent the sky from the ground-shattering creature. Far off in the distance behind Tawnos came an answering scream. Tawnos clung the horse's mane, looking behind him as they fled. The coils and arms twitched briefly, then slowly pulled themselves back into the sandy pit, covering themselves as they retracted. In another moment, the ground was as it had been before. Tawnos felt a cold trickle of sweat run down his back. If the device had merely attacked, he would only have had to avoid it or outrun it. But it had signaled that it had been tripped, and something further back had answered the scream. Tawnos dug his heels into the horse's flanks and rode hard for the passes, hoping not to meet any other hidden traps en route. He looked back once to see a cloud of dust on the horizon. Pursuit Tawnos pushed the horse harder, but when he looked back, again there was already a dark dot at the base of the cloud, ripping up the desert as it passed. A dragon engine. The land was rising now, and small, stringy shrubs dotted the rock outcroppings. Tawnos thought about hiding, but instead he chose to make for the pass. Most of the dragon engines were large, clumsy beasts and would have trouble negotiating the rocks easily. He looked back a third time and could make out the details of the dragon engine's form. It was one of the recent ones, and though it was a smoother, sleeker creation than the earlier Mishra manufactured models, it still did not compare to the monstrosities that had leveled Krug. Even at a great distance, Tawnos could see the beast's head lurch back and forth like that of a spastic insect. Tawnos smiled, but the smile died as great wings sprouted for the creature's back. They unfurled in the afternoon sun and began to beat as the engine charged forward. The cloud of dust disappeared as the mechanical creature sailed aloft. Tawnos cursed and jabbed the flanks of his mount hard, spurring it to a full gallop. He would not make it, he thought. Flying dragon engines had destroyed most of his air support atomic hull. There was nothing in the Argivian arsenal that could stand up to them. For a moment Tawnos considered abandoning his horse and hiding, but instead he pressed on. If he could reach the narrow passage at the beginning of the pass, he might be able to find an Argivian outpost before the dragon found him. He almost made it. Tawnos did not see it, but he could feel the pressure of the air as the beast dived above him. There was a roaring, and heat scorched his back. The horse screamed and stumbled, jolting him from his saddle. Tawnos dived forward, arms swung before his face to protect himself. He managed to twist and land on a shoulder, but the force of the blow rolled him to one side of the rocky outcropping. The chief scholar gagged on the smoke rising from his burning horse. It was still alive and thrashed in agony as its flesh burned away. Tawnos felt pity for the horse, but the objective part of his mind also noted that the dragon engine had breathed some sort of flaming jelly, a substance that was not extinguished even as the horse convulsed in the dirt. Something new to worry about, he thought. Tawnos looked up and saw that the dragon engine was above him, pulling up for another swooping dive. There was little cover that the flaming liquid could not breach, and the scholar had no doubt that the engine had sensed his movement and was coming back to finish the job. That was when the metal-winged birds appeared. They were like a cloud of insects that rose from the east and swarmed the great engine. At first Tawnos thought they were real birds that had somehow been driven into battle. Now he saw they were small constructs, each no larger than a man. They swooped and dived around the larger engine like sparrows harrowing a hawk. The dragon engine craned its neck back and struck against one of the smaller winged machines. The avian nimbly darted away, warned of the assault by the change in air pressure caused by the dragon's movements. Though racked with pain, Tawnos smiled. He knew what the bird artifacts were and who had built them, and from whom the builder had gotten the original idea. The bird machines dived and darted around the dragon engine. The engine managed to remain aloft, but the avians were faster than its snapping jaws. It breathed its ignited fluid, but that only brought down a single opponent. The remainder flocked around it, and beating its wings frantically, the dragon engine lost altitude. The bird machines had razor-sharp beaks and tore the outer housing of the dragon engine away. There were several holes already in the Macphower's backboard in concentrated attacks from the smaller machines. Tawnos watched as a small bird machine flew into one such tear in the engine's fuselage near the joint where the dragon engine's wing strut met the body. There was a skittering, crunching noise, and then a small explosion. The wing folded in on itself, trying to retract back into the body. The dragon shrieked in almost living pain and pitched to the left. It plummeted to the ground, its one good wing still trying to scoop the air beneath it. Tawnos crouched as the dragon engine struck the ground 200 yards west of him. Even at this distance he could feel the heat of the explosion as its liquefied tanks of fire ruptured, and the entire creature went up in an incandescent ball of flame. Tawnos shielded his eyes from the flame, and when he could look again, nothing remained but a burned-out shell of metal ribs. If the engine had been operated by crewmen, they were dead. The metal bird swooped and regathered in a flock, a chaotic combining and recombining of individuals in different flight patterns. Then they organized themselves into a V-shaped formation and winged eastward toward the pass. Tawnos limped along behind them, making for Argivian territories. "Clockwork avians," said Urza, setting down his favorite chalice. "And yes, they were based on your toy for young Harbin." "I had assumed as much," replied Tawnos, settling down in one of the overstuffed chairs that now dominated Urza's reception hall. His wounded arm was in a sling, but the master's collar was otherwise unharmed. Urza lowered himself into the opposite chair. The Lord High Artificer's hair was pure white now, and the lines around his face were deeper. Tawnos was sure Urza had lost weight since he last saw him, and he knew the older man now used spectacles with which to read. Despite himself, Tawnos reached up and ran his fingers through his own hair. It was starting to thin in the back. "After you were captured," said Urza, "I sat down with Harbin and went over all your old toys. He knew in what order you had built them and kept them in good working condition. There were some bits of brilliance among them, you know. Mostly ideas and fancies that did not seem to have immediate use," said Tawnos. "Indeed," said Urza, with a wry smile. "Well, the avians had an immediate use. Those flying dragon engines were bad enough. And when they started breathing this liquid fire," he held up his hands, "we were hard-pressed by your absence. We thought you dead." "I wasn't," said Tawnos. "Not quite." He flexed his right hand. "I'm glad you weren't," said Urza, and Tawnos saw the older man meant it. He could imagine Urza at the drawing table, turning over and over in his hands one of Harbin's toys that his son had outgrown, shoving aside the memories of their work together in order to unlock the design secrets of Tawnos's creations. The moment passed, and Urza cleared his throat. The avians were a godsend. They were simple, cheap to produce, and easy to target against Mishra's larger machines. One of the enemies of this war is distance. By the time any weapon moves from the front to somewhere it can actually do damage, a counterweapon has been created and deployed. The Clockwork avians have given us a chance against the flying dragon engines, but by the time we had regrouped to make another assault, Mishra had a new guardian on his borders. "The Groundbreakers," said Tawnos. I met one the same day I was attacked by the dragon engine. Nasty, agreed Urza. They slow the army down, which gives my brother still more time to prepare a counter-attack. What was the liquid fire? Asked Tawnos. The substance the dragon engine breathed. Another new development, said Urza, apparently out of Saranth. There are deposits of oil and thicker, more viscous fluids that bubble out of the ground there. My brother has found a way to break down that liquid to its component parts, and one of those parts is highly flammable, like goblin powder. It almost destroyed the army before we got the avians in the air. He paused for a moment. We still hold Yosha and the passes in Argive and Corlus, said Tawnos. But we haven't been able to press forward since then, concluded Urza. We're still waiting for him to make his move. 2. Attack somewhere so we can react. Neither side seems to have the power to make a major push nor the time to adequately secure the borders. And in the meantime, we're draining our resources at a faster rate. I noted more foundries on the way back to the capital, said Tawnos. More foundries, factories, and mines, returned Urza. We have felled most of the forests from Corlus and are buying metal from the Sardian dwarves. The merchants are starting to complain about the amount of gold heading north, and they're agitating for a campaign against the dwarves themselves. They want us to fold the dwarven territories into ours and their resources with them. And your opinion? Asked Tawnos, thinking he should have asked, and your decision. Instead, I don't want to attack without good reason, said the older man, but I'd prefer to keep the dwarves at an arm's length. You can't trust anyone just because they claim to distrust the Fallagy Empire and want to be your friends. The Gixians did that. Tawnos nodded. One of the first results of his return had been the rounding up and imprisonment of the priests of Gix. The fact that they were advisors in Mishra's court made many people in Argive very nervous and others very embarrassed. The priests of Gix had wheedled their way into the school while you were gone. Did you know that? Said Urza. And right under Riklaus' nose too. He was redder than a setting sun when it all came out. Nice to know there was some good from all this, said Tawnos. A silence fell between the two men. Urza frowned slightly and ground his palms together. I've been working on your clay statues as well, he said at last. I have an idea about using that primal clay material without the framework. It would be more malleable that way. Tawnos looked at his mentor. Urza, what's troubling you? He knew the older man well enough to recognize when Urza was talking around a subject. The Lord Protector raised a hand to argue, then shook his head and was silent for a time. Harbin, he said at last. He wants to be an ornithopter pilot. Tawnos nodded slightly. We've talked. He rode out to meet me like a flash of lightning as soon as word reached Penregan of your return, said Urza. When we first heard about the battle of Tomikul and feared you dead, he wanted to run out and join an army unit to avenge you, you know. I know, said Tawnos somberly. His mother was shattered when she thought you dead, said Urza, shaking his head, and looked off into the middle distance. When I came back from a campaign, Harbin never rode out to meet me. Tawnos shrugged. I know he respects you. Respects, yes, Urza said irritably. He's always so polite and respectful. His mother has taught him well there. But we don't really talk. He knew all about the toys you made for him. But he has no interest in artifice beyond how it can be used. He's bright, but that basic sense of curiosity is missing. And he thinks the world of you. He respects you, repeated Tawnos. He just grew up around me. Yes, Urza let his voice trail off, as if his thoughts took him somewhere else. Then he said, so he told you he wants to fly an ornithopter. About the second set of words out of his mouth, said Tawnos, after he made sure I was still alive. And you think? Urza raised his brows. Tawnos sighed. He's 14. That's a good age to start training. He's quick, and he's bright, as you said yourself. He'd make a good pilot. His mother will have me slain if I do, said Urza. She doesn't want her son exposed to the war. She wants him safe and secure. He should go into government, she says. She's already arranged a marriage for him when he's of age, you know. He's told me, said Tawnos. She mentioned it in one of her correspondences, said Urza, nodding at a pile of unanswered mail. Nice family. Argivian nobility. He ground his palms together. But the problem is, everyone is needed in the war. Everyone. My own factories are operating under skeleton staffs as more men and women are needed for duty. I've tried using goblin slaves in the workshops, but they create as many problems as they solve. How can I demand everyone suffer for this accursed war, then protect the boy? But if I don't, his mother will be heartbroken. I don't really want to do that either. Tawnos looked at the older man. Urza could reason out the smallest detail of a device, but real life always confounded him. I think you should let the boy take the training, said Tawnos at last, phrasing his thoughts carefully. Well, he's made his case to you, said Urza. And made it well, said the former apprentice. He's smart and has good reactions. If he's expected to eventually lead, he'd best start now. But his mother, began Urza. We'll have to accept it, finished Tawnos. I'll speak with her and remind her that I came back in one piece. Urza shook his head. If he's lost in battle. I didn't say you should send him into battle, said Tawnos. Urza raised an eyebrow, and Tawnos continued, just let him train to become a pilot. Then make sure that his assignments are in more peaceful parts of the kingdom. Don't send him to Yosha if an assault is brewing, but have him run messages to Corlus. Scouting missions. Aerial surveys. There are more than enough jobs for an ornithopter pilot that do not involve direct contact with the enemy. Urza looked at his hands. He won't like it. Then he'll complain about it, said Tawnos, and if he comes to you, you can point out how bad it would look if the Lord High Artificer and Protector of the Realm used privilege to put his own son in a combat unit over other deserving young men. Urza rubbed his chin. He'd hate that. Yes, he would, said Tawnos. You see, I have no desire to see Harbin endangered. But I think shielding him from everything will not help him either. Urza chuckled and hoisted his heavy chalice. It is good to have you back, Tawnos. I have been lessened in your absence. And I in yours, Urza, said Tawnos, raising his own goblet. But as he spoke he heard swift footfalls in the hallway outside. Both men turned toward the door as the messenger arrived, grasping the door frame to bring herself to a halt. "Chief Scholar," said the messenger. "Lord High Artificer." She gulped fire. "A message has come from the spies. Mishra's army is on the move." Both men looked at each other. Then Urza said, "Where?" "Yosha. The passes." The messenger shook her head and inhaled deeply. "Terizia City." He's headed west. For Terizia City. Chapter 27. Silix. The ivory towers were burning. The invaders had first swarmed from the desert in more than a year ago and almost overpowered the defenders in the first wave. Before the gates were closed and the great metal bolts of the portcullises secured, there were thousands of them, grim-faced desert warriors and mindless machines, spilling from the east. Like hungry insects, they looted the surrounding land, and what they could not carry they burned. They were at the gates of Terizia City within days. They failed to take the city. The gates were shut in their face, and Mishra's army was turned back. The next spring they returned with a contingent of siege equipment, battering rams, and dragon engines. Then began the siege, a slow and torturous process that racked the city and its people. The towers proved their worth, for the enemy could not get close to the walls without suffering withering fire from the spires. Each tower was in turn protected by the city walls behind it and by the adjacent towers. The entire city was wrapped in a cocoon of stone and protected by a bristling array of ballistas, archers, and grape-shot catapults. A flying dragon engine made an attempt to burn the city to the ground, but as it flew overhead it disintegrated from the firepower and shot brought to bear against it. There was no second attempt by Mishra's forces to fly over to Terizia City. Through it all there had been no clue as to the reason for the attack. The city had attempted to parley with the invaders, but any attempt to reason with them was met with arrow shot and swords. The intervening winter bought the city time, and the leaders used that time to fill the city granaries, remove its innocence, and strengthen its defenses. The Union used the interval to press forward with its studies. It had been enough, for the siege stretched into months, without a sign of either side breaking. The scholars in their ivory towers had kept one of the two most powerful armies on the continent at bay while they continued their own work, as they attempted to discover all the secrets of the third path, the path that was neither Mishra nor Urza. That path was charted by Hercule's meditative techniques, as Felden had predicted. The key lay in concentrating on the memories of one's homeland and pulling forth the unknown energies for those memories and that land. Hercule discovered the energy, but the Archimandrite named it, calling it mana. Lauren thought it. The time the name was misleading, smacking as it did of old phalange tales of wizards and not of science. But despite their name, the Archimandrite had succeeding in researching and refining this mana, had distilled it down to its base elements, and she turned those base elements into a weapon against the desert warriors. But now Hercule was dead, the Archimandrite was missing, and the city of the towers had been betrayed and occupied by the phalange. The ivory towers were isolated, surrounded within and without, and one by one they began to fall under Mishra's concentrated assault. The Archimandrite's tower, one of the few that survived intact, was in disarray. In the center of the Archimandrites hall, Drafna bellowed at the Sumi vanguards, shouting final orders for a sortie. His balding pate was barely visible over the shoulders of the gathered guards, but Lauren knew the scholars. Shout anywhere. Drafna stood up on a chair to be better heard, and Lauren saw the wildness in his eyes, the manic intensity that seemed to grip the scholar like a fever since Hercule had perished. The passage of time had not weakened that fire. He had been there when his wife had died at the gates of the city, when the Gixians had betrayed them. They had all seen the dangers without, but had ignored the rot within. The other scholars had paid scant heed to the machine, worshipping priests as they moved among them, saying little bit, listening a great deal. The Gixians had learned much in Terizia city, and the scholars often treated them as a harmless, if backward people. When the priests of the Brotherhood felt they finally knew enough, they betrayed the scholars and opened the city gates to the enemy. Hercule, ever attentive, figured out what was happening and convinced Drafna to rally those guardsmen who remained loyal. Drafna's forces tried to press back the Fallagy assault and close the gates before the enemy could enter the city proper. But Mishra's troops were ready for the assault and had a trio of dragon engines ready to capitalize on the treachery. Drafna's forces were scattered at the gates, and the dragon engines began to roll forward. That was when Hercule revealed to the enemy the greater power the Union had gained through her studies. Lauren had watched from the closest of the towers during the assault, trying to bring the catapults the bear against the advancing dragon engines without harming the loyal garrisons. Hercule stood at the city gate, and for a brief moment she was alone before the three dragon engines. She looked like a frail doll, dressed in azure, her thick black hair flying like a pennant behind her. She closed her eyes and silently raised her arms, and around her the world began to change. A glow enveloped her, a sapphire hue as blue as the seas around the island of Latnam. It radiated outward, casting a new set of shadows against the ground. The human troops wavered under the light, and the dragon engines disappeared. They were not destroyed, nor did they simply fail or retreat. Instead, they slowly faded from view. The surroundings became clearer and clearer until the engines seemed to be no more than colored fog. Then they were gone through the actions of one woman. Hercule staggered from the force of her mystic work, and Mishra's human forces took advantage of her weakness to press forward. Her sapphire blue glow was dimmed, then extinguished entirely beneath a wave of spearmen. Hercule had defeated the artifacts, but not the warriors who accompanied them. Lauren saw Drafna trying to lead a charge to where his wife had disappeared beneath the spearmen, trying to hack his way through the enemy to reach her, but it was too late. The bald-headed scholar was driven back to another tower, and the city itself fell to Mishra's forces. The city was sacked and burned, its surviving populace butchered, and its glass roof smashed so that not a single pane remained whole. The scholars in the towers collapsed, their tunnels back into the city itself sealed their windows against the smoke and the cries of the martyred, and prepared for the worst. First one, then a second, then a third of the ivory towers fell to the invaders, who moved in a circle around the city itself like an apocalyptic clock. There would be no salvation from the Fallagy, no last-minute rescue. Lauren had received correspondence from a friend still in Argive, months out of date, but speaking of a rebellion among the dwarves of the Sardia Mountains. Urza would have his own hands full, Lauren realized, and there was no one else to oppose Mishra. In the west, nature brought a brief respite. A sandstorm blew up out of the desert to the east, carrying a heavy, thick load of dust that reduced visibility and halted Mishra's army entirely. Many of the scholars used the storm as cover to escape from the city itself, taking with them what they had learned about the new teachings. Some said the Archimandrite had fled, though others said she had been captured by Mishra, and still others said the sandstorm was her doing, as the banishing of the dragon engines had been Hercules. Yet the storm would not last forever, and with its passing, the ivory towers would again begin to fall, one after another. Those scholars who had survived were preparing to abandon the city entirely now. The land beneath the towers was honeycombed with tunnels, and enough survived to allow a safe escape to the hinterlands. Drafna bellowed another set of orders at the Sumi vanguards and servants, who moved with the calm, relaxed demeanor with which Suma fans did all things. Lauren looked around but did not see Felden. She had been sure he would make it to this hour if he could. She found him in his study, staring at the Golgothian silex. He looked up briefly from the copperish bowl as she entered and sighed. "Fill it full of memories, and start over again," he said. "Scrape it all clean, like a glacier." "If what it says is true," said Lauren. "However, I think it would be as dangerous to the user as to its target." Felden grunted and rose. "I agree. Drafna ordered me to fetch every bit of artifice in the tower. He intends to lead a sortie with the surviving guards, to fight his way all the way back to Lautnam if he has to. He's in a fair mood, that one. I think he'd be more happy if he died than if he made it out. Anyway, I sent everything else down but this." His voice died as he stroked the side of the silex. "Do you think it will work?" asked Lauren. "That it will end everything as it claims?" Felden looked at her. "Do you want to find out?" he asked. Lauren looked at the bowl for a long moment, her thoughts racing. Then she shook her head. "There's too much we don't know about this." Felden nodded. "Agreed. But if we do not use something like this, what should we do with it?" "We should destroy it," said Lauren. "I don't know if we can," said Felden. "It's been beneath the sea for who knows how long, and it has resisted every attempt to take a sliver of metal from its side. Perhaps Hercule could have done something to it with her mana." Again he let his voice die. He looked at the bowl for a long time. "I don't want to give it to Drafna," he said. "Are you afraid he'd lose it?" asked Lauren. "I'm afraid he'll use it," corrected Felden. "Since Hercule died, he's been, well, strange. I don't think he really cares if the rest of the world survives or not." "His world died with his wife," Lauren said, and Felden nodded in agreement. "So take it with you yourself. We have to leave soon." "With my game leg I won't get far," said Felden. He tapped his cane against his twisted limb for effect. "I'm going to try to get out, but I think I'd better be traveling light." There was a pause, and Lauren said, "You want me to take it? That's where this is going." Felden gave a bear-like shrug. "You're leaving as well, either by the tunnels or with Dravna's charge." "By the tunnels," said Lauren. "And you're coming with me too old, too lame, he said. You'd make better time without me. And there's better chance of the knowledge surviving if we split up. There's a small town at the foot of the Ronham Glacier called Kether. I'll meet you there within the year if I survive. But, yes, you should take it. Lauren pursed her lips. By me. Have you been able to use the meditative techniques? Asked Felden. Have you been able to pull the mana from the land? Lauren held up her hands. I don't believe that this is magic. Of any type. It's merely science that we have yet to understand. Felden leaned against his chair. The answer would then be, no, you have not. Lauren looked at Felden, then at the bowl. He was right. She had not been able to master the techniques, either because her own memories of home were too faded, or her home was too remote, or the land was no longer as she remembered it. She considered that option as well and wondered if that was part of the science of this new and untried field. At last she shook her head. That's why you should take it, said Felden. I've had small success myself, though I think of the mountains and ice when I do it. Everyone seems to be different and can manifest slightly different effects. Yet you have not, and that is why you should take it. Because if something bad happens, I will not be able to use it in a moment of weakness, said Lauren flatly. Felden looked at the woman and let out a deep, heavy sigh. Lauren took the bowl. The feeling of shadow descended upon her as she grasped it, and she almost let it go. Instead she hefted it, looked at Felden, and said, do you have a bag for this? Felden produced a battered backpack, one of his own from his glacier exploring days, and Lauren slid the bowl into it. It was heavy, but its weight was minor compared to the aura of dread that surrounded it. Lauren and Felden made their goodbyes, and she hugged him. When they parted, there were tears in her eyes. Come with me, she urged. We'll scatter like geese, said Felden. They can shoot only so many of us. Small comfort if you're one of the geese that's shot, said Lauren. Look after yourself. You as well, said Felden. Then she was gone. Felden packed the last of his own belongings in a second backpack, pausing as he heard Drafna bellowing orders, readying the surviving troops for their assault. By now Lauren would be in the tunnels, hopefully still free of Mishra's forces and the hated Gixians. Felden hoisted his pack and shook it, trying to move the heavier items to the bottom. Below he heard the great doors of the tower swing open and the cries of the men and women who were going to fight their way past Mishra's army. At least, he thought. Wryly, that's what they hoped. Felden counted to 100 just to assure himself they would be gone, then counted to 100 a second time. Then, gripping his walking cane securely in one hand, he began to hobble his way down to the tunnels. As he limped along, he mumbled prayers for himself, for the rest of the surviving Skullies, for Drafna, for the Archimandrite, and for Lauren. Particularly for Lauren. A month later, Lauren lay dying, her right side smashed and twisted by the rock fall. A few feet away from her, the silex had spilled out of its backpack and lay glimmering among the rubble. She had made it to the foothills of the Kulkan Mountains before disaster struck. The surviving populace had flowed through Mishra's lines like water through a steel sieve, spilling in all directions, seeking escape to every cardinal point save east. Lauren had joined a group of Umok nationals who wanted no more than to quit these supposedly civilized lands and return to their upland homes. They were moving through the first passes when the avalanche hit. It struck without warning, one moment a caravan of refugees wound its way among the cliffs, the next there was thunder from a clear blue sky and a rain of stone and soil as the path disappeared. Lauren heard screams and shouts around her, but they were soon lost in a torrent of rock. Not after all this, she remembered thinking. She made a silent, impassioned plea to gods long ignored. She remembered thinking as well, this was no accident. She had been right. Now that the dust had settled, figures moved among the debris. At first she thought they were other refugees who had survived the rockslide and were searching for survivors. She tried to raise an arm to call them and realized she could not move her right arm. Her entire side was a thick smear of blood along her travel cape, and it hurt to move her head to look at it. Suddenly she realized the figures were not Umoks. They were dressed entirely in spiked armor with heavy, flowing capes. They moved among the debris, poking at bodies nonchalantly with their swords. They were looters. They had set the avalanche, she realized. They had brought the mountain down on the caravan to scavenge the bodies. She must had shuddered or spasmed in pain at the thought, for a voice over her right shoulder called, "We've got a survivor." The voice was muffled behind steel but fairly close. "Good," responded another voice, this one female and unmuffled. "I was afraid that you did your job too effectively, Captain." Lauren tried to turn herself about to see who was talking, but she could only twitch. Heavy, gauntleted hands laid on her shoulder, and she felt pain radiate from her wounds. A face hove into view, hidden behind a thick metal visor. It looked like one of Urza's automatons, save for the fact that there were human eyes behind the eye holes. They were not particularly warm or comforting, but they were human. "Alive or dead?" asked the female voice. "Alive, but not by much," said the man behind the visor. His breathing was as sharp as her own, and Lauren realized what was in those eyes. Pain. There was pain in the soldier's eyes. "We don't need by much," said the woman. The armored figure stepped aside for a moment, and Lauren saw the woman. She was dressed in similar spiked armor, but lacked a helmet. Lauren could see thick red curls spilling onto her shoulder plates. "We just need a little information," the woman continued coldly, "and then she can die like the others." There was no pain in this red-haired woman's eyes. Only power. "Milady, look at this," said the soldier, coming back into view. He was carrying the bowl-shaped silex. Lauren must have tried to move, twisted in place, tried to say something. All she knew was that a moment later she was in intense pain, pain that seared through her like a blade. When her senses cleared again, she saw the red-haired leader turning the silex over in her hands. "Ashnod," she realized, and wondered if her lips formed the words as she said them. But word was that Ashnod had been cast out from Mishra's camp. What was she doing here, with her own soldiers, then? "Interesting," said Ashnod, running her slender fingers along the inside of the bowl, tracing the script within as it spiraled to the base. "Most interesting. And I think our little friend knows about it. You're no Umok, nor Phalange. Some scholar from the East, perhaps." Lauren said nothing and wondered if she would be able to die before anything else horrible happened to her. The stories of Ashnod's cruelty were legendary. The red-haired woman seemed to read her mind, for she said, "We're going to have to nurse this one back to health, Captain. And then she has much that she's going to tell us. I'm sure of that." Lauren willed herself to die, but her only reward was Ashnod's laughter. Chapter 28. Our Hearth. Gwenna watched her invader from her perch on the interwoven upper branches of the trees. She spotted this one first and therefore it was her claim, her invader. The others were going back to the hamlet to send messages farther south to Citadel and Titania's court to ask for judgment on this development. Until then it was her duty to watch him and judge the invader. She had never seen an invader before, though there were enough stories about invaders over the years for her to know they came in all shapes and sizes. They were similar in that they were not from Argoth, usually driven to shore by the storms that protected the island. All invaders were similar because they had no contact with the land at all and did not understand it. This invader was managed like the druids of Citadel, Argoth's only true city. The invader was taller than these druids, and had sandy blonde hair gathered in a horse's tail behind its head. It was dressed in blue pants and white shirt with a blue jacket that now hung from the side of its craft. The invader said something in a language Gwenna did not know and kicked the machine. Gwen assumed it was a Manish curse, invoking Manish gods who never listened anyway. Gwenna herself was elvish, as were most of the natives of Argoth. There were pixies, treefolk, and all manner of other forest dwellers on Argoth, but the elves were the smartest and most refined of all the races, at least in Gwenna's opinion. There were only a few of the Manish breed, and they tended to keep to their holy orders and stone retreats. Gwenna wondered why, since there were so many elves in the world, most of the invaders from the old tales were Manish in nature. Invaders almost always came by sea, the boats smashed on the surrounding reefs or pulled into small maelstroms around the island's coast. They were usually waterlogged, battered, and weak by the time they arrived, and as such put up little or no fight when it was time to kill them. This one, however, came from the air and seemed to be in much better shape for it. The invader's craft looked like a wounded bird curled up on the white sand of the beach. If Gwenna had not seen it land, she would not have thought it could fly at all. Indeed, it was hardly much of a flyer, more of plummetic, for it dived like a cormorant for the beach, pulling up only at the last moment. Even then, it had smashed into the sands with a bone-thumping crunch. One wing was twisted at an odd angle now as a result of that crash. Titania's law was fair but firm on the matter of invaders. They should be watched, and word sent back to Citadel, to Titania's court. If it damaged the island, as most invaders did, sooner or later, it would have to be destroyed. Gwenna could not imagine why this particular invader needed to be destroyed, but such was Titania's law, serving the great goddess Gia. This invader looked mostly harmless, unlike a waterlogged savage. But those were the rulings of the land. Observe the invader to see what crimes it committed against their land, and then, when the order came from the court, dispatch it before it could cause any further damage. Gwenna watched. Harbin circled the crashed ornithopter, then kicked it again. The blow did not do anything to repair the smashed device, and it made him feel only slightly better about his situation. When his father agreed to allow him to train to be an ornithopter pilot, he dreamed of flying such a craft into battle. Instead, he had spent a dozen years on routine matters, running messages and orders throughout the combined kingdoms of Argive, Corlus, and Yosha, conducting surveys along the northern coast of Malpari, carrying diplomats and bureaucrats from Krug to Pendragon. They were vital assignments, but safe ones. He tried to be reassigned to a combat unit, or at least to a garrison unit, but received no aid from his elders. Mother had been adamant against his flying in the first place. Father had been cool and distant, as always, and spoke about the importance of not showing favoritism. That was very much like Father, the perfect answer to every question. Even Uncle Tawnos was sympathetic but did not attempt to change matters. There had been excitement in his work. He was once assaulted by Malpari tribesmen when on the ground and discovered falange raiding parties 4 separate times. On one such occasion, he was pursued by a flying dragon engine and outflew it, bringing it within range of one of his father's clockwork avian flocks. Yet, still, while most other pilots had been moved to the front, he had been left behind in relative safety. Harbin smelled the plot, and the plot stank of his elders' collusion. He tried once more for a combat posting and was told that after his present tour of duty he should settle down to a training position. He was 26 now, they said, practically as antique as the first primitive ornithopters. Milana, his wife, would like him to take the training position, but then his wife spent all her time in Mother's court and would like nothing more than for Harbin to abandon flying altogether. There was a rustling among the forest leaves, and Harbin tensed, his hand going automatically to his sword hilt. The rustle continued, and soon a pair of eyes on multicolored stalks raised from the impenetrable green. The eyes blinked at Harbin in the sunlight, then pulled back and retreated deeper into the forest. Harbin caught a flash of yellow and black striping and realized he had been looking at a forest slug, though one almost as large as himself. The slug was more afraid of him than he was of it. Harbin shook his head and realized that he was still gripping his sword hilt. The blade was one of Tawnos's new metals, lighter, stronger, and more versatile than the blades previously in use. The blades had proved useful in combat and had turned the tide in a number of critical battles against Mishra's forces. Harbin carried one of the first of the new metal blades, and his craft had been one of the latest longer-winged, lighter creations from Urza's workshops. Had it been a lesser craft, it would not have survived the storms that drove him to this strange beach. More collusion of the elders in controlling his life, thought Harbin. More unwanted protection that probably saved his life. The storm had come out of nowhere as he skirted the Corlusian coast. He tried running from it but was driven farther and farther out to sea. He tried to climb above it, but the rising anvil of the thunderstorm kept towering over him like a great wave. It was as if the storm held its own intelligence and was intent on keeping Harbin from escaping its grip. At last he flew into the storm itself and was battered for 3 days and 3 nights by its fury. Howling winds threatened to snap the wings and peel back the protective housing, while bolts of lightning chained around him. Odd electrical fires danced along the wings and the guide pulleys. For one horrible moment the entire craft had been inverted, and Harbin saw the sea rise before him like a wall of water before he regained control of the craft. Then the storm was gone and he was in clear air. Behind him, the storm still boiled like soup, but ahead there was land. Huge rolling expanse of greenery, where the land met the sea. There shone a bright strip of white sand, gleaming like a beacon. Exhausted from 3 days of continual battle against the sky, Harbin brought the wounded craft down hard on the beach and felt something give as the craft landed. He tumbled from the ornithopter and collapsed on the sand in exhaustion beneath one of its half-folded wings. It was afternoon when he awoke, and Harbin could not be sure if he had slept a few hours or a few days. He had been undisturbed, and fortunately he had set the craft down above the high tide mark. Brushing the sand from his uniform, he surveyed his surroundings and the damage to his craft. His world was a straight line of beach of such a white brilliance that it hurt his eyes. The sky above was a crystalline blue, unmarked by clouds overhead, but turning first white, then grey, and finally black along the horizon out to sea. The storm was still offshore, waiting patiently like a cat at a mouse hole. Inland was a verdant jungle, seemingly untouched by man. It began at the beach's edge with a thick tangle of low-lying vegetation, but soon mounted in towering, white-bark trees of a type that Harbin had never seen before. The forest was so ancient that the upper branches were interlocked, forming huge canopies. Harbin wondered if perhaps this was the way Argive had looked long before fansThe and Mishra began the continual war. Before the lands were strip-mined and the skies turned dark from the factory smoke. Perhaps this was the way paradise was supposed to look. Harbin took a sighting on the sun. He was south of civilized lands, farther south than the southern Corlesian coast. He had no idea of his longitude. Home could be due north, or northwest, or northeast. If he guessed northwest, Harbin figured if he flew that direction, he would probably hit land. Eventually, Harbin looked back at his craft. It was mostly in good shape. Some of the wires had snapped, and the pulleys along one of the control surfaces were stripped, the result of his landing. The worst effect of the storm had been to splinter the right wing strut. It held up to the brunt of the storm, but cracked halfway through. It would have to be replaced before he took another chance with the winds aloft. Harbin kicked the craft a third time, but not as hard. Then he opened the housing and pulled out the repair kit every ornithopter carried. Within the steel box was a collection of tools, a hammer, and an axe with 2 spare heads, a flexible piece of saw-toothed metal, spools of wire and spare pulleys, spools of thinner catgut, and steel needles to repair holes in the wings, a bald coil of rope. He thumbed through the box. Fishing hooks, tape measure, emergency rations, flint and tinder, an oversized hat to protect from the sun. Harbin looked at the collection and felt father's heavy hand again. It was as if his elder thought of every contingency for such a crash. And Urza probably had. Harbin gnawed on a chunk of smoked meat and walked around his craft a few more times. With the exception of the main strut, he could take the ornithopter aloft immediately. But he would have to find the right tree for the replacement strut. That meant going into the jungle, the one with the huge black and yellow slugs in it. Harbin hoped the slugs were the worst of the dangers in the primeval forest. He hefted his axe and headed into the thick vegetation. Titania's rules on invaders were straightforward and strict. and Gwenna knew what the response to her report would probably be. Still, she followed the letter of the law in dealing with the latest invader. She watched. Of course, word would come from the court that if the invader had not damaged the land, it should be captured. If it had damaged the land, it should be killed. And of course, given time to communicate, even mystically, back to the court and to gain a response, it was inevitable that the invader would do something to damage the land and would have to be destroyed. Gwenna felt a slight touch of sympathy for the invader. It did not know it was signing its own death sentence by stealing Gare's bounty without permission. Perhaps that was Titania's intention after all. Titania spoke for the goddess Gia, and the elves, pixies, and Treefic listened. The invader moved gingerly through the border vegetation, trying to find a path through the undergrowth. The scrub and vine maples tugged at its pants, and the water dripping from the canopy above left dark stains on its white shirt. Gwenna started after it, moving quietly from tree to tree by the interlocking branches, remaining out of sight. Once she brushed a dead branch and sent it clattering to the forest floor. She remained perfectly still as the invader scanned the area, looking for her. Then it set out again, and she followed an arboreal shadow. Once he was past the scrub vegetation on the beach, the territory opened up beneath the great trees. The soil was thick here with rotted vegetation, and the canopy was broken only by blown down and toppled trees. The fallen giants served as nurse logs for new growths, straining for what little light penetrated the leaves above. The invader stopped at one of these glades and chose a particularly straight sapling of yarrow wood. It circled the tree 3 times, then nodded and pulled a strip from its shirt and tied it around the trunk at about eye level. Then it headed back for the beach in a clear line. Though it did not use it, the invader carried an axe in its hand. Gwenna knew in an instant what the invader's intent was. By cutting down the live tree, it would sign its death warrant. The messengers would return and they would say, "Has the invader damaged the land?" Gwenna would be forced to respond, "Yes, he cut down a sapling." The messenger would say, "Then the invader must be similarly cut down." And to Gwenna that seemed a waste. She wanted to know more about the broken bird thing that the invader rode. How could it fly and carry a mannish invader? There had never been a winged invader before. Perhaps they needed to learn more of it and leave it alive. Gwenna quickly scouted the area and found a nearby deadfall, where a huge pale root had recently blown over in a storm, taking other yarrows and tangle oaks with it. She found an uprooted yarrow about the same size as the one the invader marked. This tree had been recently killed by the fall. She offered the proper prayers to Gia and removed the dying branches of the yarrow with her own blade, then pulled the entire sapling to where the invader would return, and laid it across the path. The invader returned with a large coil of rope and found its way blocked by the fallen sapling. It was confused, then looked at the tree it was about to fell, then at the deadfall. It shrugged, a curious, mannish shrug, and tied the rope to the fallen sapling, taking Gwenna's offering and sparing the living tree. It pulled and struggled and cursed in its strange language, and finally dragged the dead tree back to its campsite. Gwenna felt relieved she did not have to kill the invader immediately. The invader came back within the forest one other time, to find fresh water. It didn't kill anything then, either. Instead, surviving on food it brought with it and fishing in the gentle surf. Fishing was permitted by Titania, she only protected the land. The invader spent most of its time hacking at the yarrow, then removing one of the bird thing's wings and replacing it with the spar it had carved. Gwenna watched but found its actions boring and confusing. It would measure something, cut it, measure again, cut again, and eventually trimmed the new spar to resemble the old. These actions seemed a waste of time to Gwenna. The nights were warm, and the invader did not light a fire, though it obviously laid one as a signal to others, perhaps. She thought, were there more of these flying men in the world? On the fourth night the invader retired early, and Gwenna crept down from her arboreal perch, leaving the forest and crossing onto the beach itself. She felt odd without the protection of the trees above, but her curiosity had gotten the best of her. The invader was sleeping in the belly of its wounded bird, now sporting a new wing of roughly hewn yarrow. She was close enough to see the invader clearly now and thought about how much like a child it looked. Soft cheeks and a smooth forehead. She was close enough to touch it, to draw her dagger across its throat as it slept. She could do it too, and claimed that the invader had despoiled the land in some way and as such had to be destroyed. But in her heart she knew she could not lie to her fellows, and besides, Gia would know the truth. If Gia knew, Titania would find out. And she was still curious how the bird thing worked. The invader struggled in its sleep, reacting to some threat in its dreams. Gwenna darted out of view, and the young mannish invader mumbled something and twisted in its sleep again. Gwenna circled the craft once more and knew that it was a made thing that smelled of dead wood and oily resins. Then she retreated back to her hiding place to continue the watch, as Titania would have wanted it. In the morning, Gwenna was startled awake by a new sound that convinced her in a moment she had made a mistake in sparing the young invader. She could see the beach from where she perched, and the bird thing was moving now. The invader was within it, and the bird thing was flapping its great wings. There was a high, whining noise that hurt her ears, and the sand billowed out in great, dusty clouds beneath the moving wings. The invader's craft took a single, low hop on the beach, then a second, and then shot into the air like an arrow. Gwenna watched the mechanical creation gain altitude, the wires that ran through its wings singing as it caught the wind. Like a kite, the bird thing began to circle and spiral upward over the warming sand of the beach. Gwenna wondered if it was going to fly deeper into the island's heart, and how she was supposed to follow it if it did. Instead, the bird thing increased its altitude until it was a small dot, then flew northwest toward the continual line of storms that marked the borders of Titania's influence. Gwenna came out of the beach again, watching the small craft as it became smaller still and finally disappeared entirely from her sight. She had not expected the bird thing to fly again. She had not expected the invader to be foolish enough to escape. She had no doubt it would fail in the attempt and be driven back to shore elsewhere along the island coast. But if it was driven back or destroyed by the storm, she did not see it. An elder came to her 2 days later and found her still at her post, waiting for the bird thing to return. She told him that she had watched the invader as he repaired his craft and then departed. the elder asked, and did it damage the land while it was here? Gwenna replied, no, it did not. The elder thought for a moment, surprised by the answer. Then he said, then you did the right thing not to slay it if it violated no law. And that was that. The invader did not return that month, nor in the month that followed, nor in the month after that. No one found the remains of the invader or its bird thing along the rest of the coastline, and it was assumed it had been destroyed by the storms that surrounded and protected Argoth. Gwenna was unsure. There was a nagging in her stomach about the invader, about the fact that she kept it from despoiling the land and thereby preserved it from death. She wondered if she had done something wrong in letting it live. To Argoth's pain and her own shame, she would live to see how wrong she had been. Chapter 29. Mana and Artifice. The assistant announced Harbin's arrival to the Lord High Artificer and Protector of the combined kingdoms of Argive, Corlys, and Yosha. Harbin did not wait for Urza to respond but was in the room already, hot on the assistant's heels, not giving